Hello, my name is Steve Moyes. Welcome to this video on Tom Wright and biblical theology. Tom Wright is arguably the most influential biblical theologian of our time. As well as his academic series, Christian Origins and the Question of God, which includes the New Testament and the people of God, Jesus and the victory of God, the resurrection of the Son of God, and Paul and the faithfulness of God, he has written commentaries on all of the New Testament books in his For Everyone series, as well as individual books like Surprised by Hope and God and the Pandemic. In this video, I will explore his approach to biblical theology and give some examples. The first thing to say is that Wright is an historian and he subscribes to an approach called critical realism. This was originally associated with the science and religion debates of the 1960s and was subsequently used by scholars such as Arthur Peacock and John Polkinghorne in the 70s and 80s. When applied to history, critical realism aims for a middle path between a naive positivism that assumes that facts can simply be read off from data and a postmodern relativism that assumes that so-called facts are simply disguised personal opinions. Thus, according to Wright, our approach to history must be both critical, there are always other ways of construing the data, and realist, there really is something outside of ourselves to be construed. For example, despite the diversity of understandings of Jesus, both in the church and outside, no serious historian doubts that such a person existed. The second thing to say about Wright's method is the fundamental role he places on story as the means for connecting events into something meaningful. Now, Christian theologians have regularly interpreted events in the light of a creation, fall, salvation, end times story. But this is not a story told in Old Testament times. In fact, Adam is only mentioned 3 times outside of Genesis 4 and 5, and 2 of them are referring to a place. Eve is not mentioned at all. Rather, Jews look back to Abraham as their founding father, Moses as their liberator and lawgiver, and David as their king. But alongside these high spots, the scriptures detail Israel's many rebellions that led to the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles in 721 and 586, respectively. These events are encapsulated in the story of Deuteronomy 27:30, which begins with a prediction of curse and exile, but ends with the promise. Even if you are exiled to the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, in order that you may live. Israel celebrated the Exodus each Passover time, and this story became the model for a new Exodus by the prophets, notably Isaiah. Isaiah 40 opens with a voice crying out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." This act of liberation will result in a proclamation of good news. Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good tidings. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings. Lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. And what will this divine visit amount to? In terms of pastoral care, he will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom. In terms of cosmic renewal, for I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. Now look at how Mark's gospel begins. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. This has been traditionally taken as a prophecy of John the Baptist's ministry in the wilderness, which immediately follows. But Wright asserts that any Jew would immediately recognize the quotation as coming from Isaiah 40, the chapter that promises a new Exodus where God will lead his people out of their current wilderness and into the new creation. Wright makes two significant doctrinal points from this. First, in terms of salvation, Mark is announcing that Jesus is the one who will bring about the new Exodus and will ultimately lead to a new heaven and earth. To those who have claimed that Mark has a very primitive understanding of salvation, compared, for example, to Paul, Wright responds that it doesn't get much bigger than the inauguration of the promised new creation. Second, Mark has also been seen to have a rather primitive Christology, especially in comparison to John. But Isaiah is not promising the coming of a prophet or even the Messiah, but the coming of God. He is the one who is meant by the you, your, way of the Lord, and his in the quotation. And as the gospel unfolds, there is no doubt that Mark intends his readers to see Jesus as the fulfillment of this. Hence the evil spirit in Mark 1:24 says, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Thus, far from offering a primitive Christology, Mark is identifying Jesus as the promised return of God in person. Similarly, Paul says in Romans 8:14-16, "For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, 'Abba, Father,' it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God." Now, most Christians take this as a reference to our inner spiritual life, and it is indeed that. But Wright argues that if we read it against the Exodus story, there is so much more. The Israelites were led out of slavery, adopted as God's children, and brought into the promised land. So now Christians are led out of their slavery to sin, adopted as God's children, and made fit for the new heaven and earth. Now you might think this sounds a bit fanciful, but consider what comes next. Creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So the Exodus, New Exodus story has significantly shaped Paul's account of salvation. According to Wright, those who have been taught that Christianity is all about an inner spiritual experience now and going to heaven in the future have been more influenced by Plato and Western individualism than a true biblical theology. In terms of Christology, many scholars have pointed out that in Paul's earliest letters, he is happy to speak of Jesus as the one through whom God works. And it is only in the later prison letters of Colossians and Philippians that the divinity of Christ is fully asserted. Thus in 1 Corinthians 8:6, Paul says, "There is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." This is undoubtedly asserting something very significant about Jesus. There is one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. But as Dunn and others have pointed out, Paul is being very careful to distinguish the Father as source, from whom and for whom, and Jesus as the agent, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. But Wright believes that this is to miss the essential Old Testament background of the phrase. The so-called Shema prayer recited daily by the Jews is based on Deuteronomy 6:4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." This was absolutely fundamental to Jewish identity, that their God is one and there is no other. Paul endorses this when he says there is one God. But he then does two things. First, he names the one God as the Father. But second, he picks up the word Lord, which is another name for God in the Shema, and identifies it with Jesus Christ. He acknowledges that Dunn is correct in pointing out that they have different functions, from whom and through whom, but that is not the key point. The key point is that Paul has deliberately quoted the fundamental confession of Judaism, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one," and effectively exegeted it to point to two beings, the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, within the overall statement, that God is one. So in 1 Corinthians, written only 3 or 4 years after the earliest letters of Thessalonians and Galatians, Paul is articulating the full divinity of Christ, even though other themes such as his pre-existence or role in creation will not be made explicit until the prison letters some 10 years later. So it is not difficult to see why Wright is popular among Christians, especially evangelicals. He affirms that the divinity of Christ and the salvation he brings belongs to the earliest strata of the New Testament and are not some later imposition on it. Indeed, he believes he can demonstrate that they go back to Jesus himself, particularly in his Jesus and the Victory of God book. However, it would be wrong to think that Wright is just an apologist for orthodox Christian doctrine, as one might expect from a former bishop. We read in Mark 13 that Jesus prophesies a time when the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Most Christians read this in the light of the creedal statement that he will come again to judge the living and the dead, and the darkening of sun and moon is talking about the end of the world. But Wright argues that anyone who knew their scriptures would deduce two things from Jesus' words. Firstly, the language of sun, moon, and stars not giving their light is apocalyptic language, as in Isaiah 13:10 and Joel 2:10, where it is not referring to the end of the world, but a coming disaster. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. And in Joel, the earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. Both texts are talking about an invading enemy. And Mark makes it clear at the beginning of the chapter that the disaster that is mentioned is the destruction of the temple, when, quote, not one stone will be left here upon another, Mark 13:2. Christians do not need to worry that 2,000 years have passed since Jesus predicted the end of the world. He is predicting the fall of Jerusalem, which indeed happened in the year 70, around 40 years after Jesus uttered these words. Second, the language of Jesus coming on the clouds is not supposed to indicate a mode of transport to get Jesus from heaven to earth. The language comes from another apocalyptic section of the Old Testament, this time Daniel 7:13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Daniel is not describing a journey from heaven to earth. The movement, if that is the right word, is towards God. In other words, what we have here is an enthronement scene where the one who is in human form, which is the meaning of like a son of man, is received into God's presence. And this is Jesus' meaning. They think they are getting rid of a blasphemer, but when he dies, he will be taken into God's presence, as Daniel saw in his vision. It has nothing to do with the supposed second coming of Jesus, and neither do those parables about masters leaving their property to servants until he returns. Jews of Jesus' day would not have thought, aha, he's talking about his second coming. Rather, in terms of their main Exodus, New Exodus story, they would have thought that the master is God, who has given the Jews tasks to do until he returns. And the critical question posed by such parables is that now that God has returned in the form of Jesus and the new Exodus has been launched, are you on board or not? Thus we can see that Wright's biblical theology is about showing how the major narratives of the Old Testament have been fulfilled as well as transformed in the New. It is not about proof texting, as in proving that Isaiah really did have the Virgin Mary in mind when he spoke about a young woman conceiving. It is about the fundamental narratives that shape Jewish identity and Jewish hopes, the main one being that Yahweh would return to bring his people out of slavery and exile and into the promised new heaven and earth. An obvious question for Wright is whether the Old Testament narrative is sometimes imposed on rather than discovered in the New Testament material. For example, despite Wright saying that no one who knew the scriptures would take Jesus' second coming literally, this is precisely what Luke seems to have done in Acts 1:11. This Jesus, who has been taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. Recognizing that this contradicts his view, Wright says, although the idea of Jesus' return, the so-called second coming, has a place in Luke's writings, it is neither central nor major, and in any case occurs within the Lucan corpus only in Acts. It looks much more like a post-Easter innovation than a feature of Jesus' own teaching. He may be correct in this, but it goes against the unity that he claims to have discovered.